Herbert Gintis. I'm an economist, and I work on questions about cooperation in humans and other organisms. Well, when my wife first got pregnant in 1971, I decided I should learn about biology. So I got all these neat books, and then when he was 3 years old in 1975, I read E.O. Wilson's wonderful sociobiology. And when I was younger, I was part of the radical faculty and students, and we fought against the war in Vietnam and for gender equality and all this good stuff. And we were revolutionaries. So after 1975 or so, I figured out I didn't want to be a revolutionary, and there wasn't going to be a revolution. So what's next best? Evolution. Just take off the R, and you've got a whole new topic, a whole new way of thinking about how society changes, and it has the added attraction of being scientifically correct. It's not new. Alfred Marshall, who was the greatest, or certainly the most popular and perhaps the greatest economist of the late 19th century, he thought that economics should be based on evolution, not on physics. And he was very hostile to the physics types of economists that were developing new theories in that day. So it's certainly not new. Well, after World War II, business schools really blossomed all over the United States. All the major universities set up business schools. And before that, businessmen were just businessmen. They didn't go to college, or if they did, they learned Greek and Latin. They didn't learn anything about business. But these new business schools were very professional, and when they wanted to teach economics, they simply borrowed from the economics discipline. It's called in economics Homo Economicus. Homo Economicus is not that popular anymore, but it certainly was after World War II. And Homo Economicus has no emotions. He's totally interested in maximizing his wealth and income. And he really doesn't care about other people, although he does care about leisure. So leisure and income and wealth are the only things. So when they taught this to business school students, it obviously followed that that if you're a good businessman, you should just maximize your material wealth. You should do whatever you can to get as much as possible. So this is greedy. Yeah. Being greedy is human, and it's good to do. And the more greedy you are, the more successful you'll be. Here's the way society profits is the stockholders have to give you the proper incentives to do the right thing when you're being greedy. And those incentives were basically give you stock in the company. So if the company does well, you get a lot of money. Now, this was a nice idea. The problem is that if you're really greedy, you can change the stock price of in your industry, in your firm, without it being in the long run interest of the firm. So they start doing all sorts of stock manipulations that increase their income in the short run, but in the long run, it really hurt companies. And also, it led to managers who were just crooks. The corruption was why not? If you can get away with it, just lie and steal. And because that was the culture of the corporation, there weren't even very many whistleblowers because everybody knew that that's the name of the game. You get away with whatever you can.
And it's somehow normative.
It's normative, right? It's like in basketball, they have fouls. It's not a sin to foul someone. It's a part of the game. You do it when it's proper to do it. If you overdo it, then they call it flagrant, and they can kick you out of the game. But the idea of having two sets of books, one up in the ceiling and one, for the tax collectors, no problem. And I want to emphasize, it's not true that most corporations are highly corrupt. They're not. American corporations are pretty honest, but there is enough corruption so it becomes sufficiently serious so it becomes front page news often in things like the Enron case and hedge fund fraud, etc. In the professions like medicine and law and science, there are norms that people are supposed to follow. When you go to medical school, they don't teach you, figure out how much the patient can pay and then prescribe the medicine that maximizes your income. They don't say that. They say your job is to cure. It's the so-called Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. And if doctors were totally selfish and greedy, we couldn't run a medical system the way we do it at all. Similarly in law, and in science. If scientists said, well, I'll just produce whatever results I can get that maximize my income, there'd be 10 times or 100 times as much fraud in science. In fact, people, this is where you get to kind of human nature. Most people are basically honest, and they prefer to be honest as long as other people are being honest. If everybody around them is corrupt, most people will be, or a lot of people will just say, well, it's not worth it, and they will go along with the crowd. But there's a lot of innate sense of moral performance or moral values and character virtues like honesty and trustworthiness that people have, and these evolved in our evolution as a species in hunter-gatherer societies. So it's all over. There's no place in the world where they do not have, no society is missing a concept of honesty, of integrity, of shame, of guilt. Well, guilt actually, there's one was found where they can't distinguish between shame and guilt in this small-scale society. But these are universal human capacities that can be drawn on to make a good society. And in fact, we argue, Samuel Bowles, my co-author, and I argue in our book, A Cooperative Species, that the reason we've been so successful as a species is because we foster, through social relations, we foster pro-social values like honesty and trustworthiness, and also what we call altruistic punishment, which means people punish people who they think are doing wrong. They don't just leave it up to the government. People get very angry, and they get very abusive when they see misdeeds being done. So the famous philosopher Tacitus once said, without morality, laws are in vain. Meaning that if behind every legitimate law is a moral sentiment which lead people to approve of and enforce the law, not just the police and the jails. And without that, if you just have police and jails, it's a police state, and those don't operate very well anyway. Well, I don't want to overdo it. What I said was that you should understand in your life, that if you are a good moral person, you're going to be better off and happier and will have a better life than if you try to chisel all the time. And even if you get away with it, you won't be as well off as if you act morally in society. How do we know this? Well, we've done a lot of experiments about this. We can say who's happy and who isn't. And the amount of money you have is very weak. The amount of good you've done is very strong. And in fact, if you go back to the old religions, or even Aristotle, if you read Aristotle's moral theory, he's what they call a virtue theorist. The best thing to do is to be virtuous. It's hard to be virtuous, he said, but there's no question, but the best life you can have is to be virtuous. You'll be happiest, you'll be most satisfied with yourself, and other people will similarly be satisfied with you if you're virtuous. Virtue is just hard. We're all tempted all the time to do the wrong thing, to get immediate pleasure instead of doing the right thing and getting the long-term benefit of being a moral individual. So temptation impedes our being virtuous, and also sometimes we just don't know what the right virtuous thing is. Is it virtuous to think gay marriage is right, or is it virtuous to think it's wrong? Well, that's a big question. We don't know. Or some people thought we don't know, and there's a big debate about it. But basically, Altruism in the biological literature usually is the individual takes a hit to help the other guy. It hurts you, but it helps the other guy. Now, for most species, that's exactly right when that happens. Precisely right. The soldier termite that explodes himself at the entrance of the one of the entrances of the termite mound is certainly sacrificing himself for the rest of the termites. But humans don't maximize fitness. We may have maximized fitness in our evolution in a hunter-gatherer stage, but nobody can tell you that you maximize fitness. The idea is completely absurd. You use contraceptives, you wait late to marry, you limit the number of children you have, and in every society they have what they call the demographic transition. When income per capita becomes a certain level, all of a sudden people don't want to make as many kids. It's the only species that we know of that limits its production of offspring without a constraint from predators or parasites or food. Well, first of all, Homo economicus is wrong, and you shouldn't teach people wrong things. The correct view is that people trade off personal self-interest and satisfaction against their moral values all the time. And some people go way on the end of being selfish and having no morality, and some people go perhaps excessively on the other end of doing what's good for everybody else and never thinking about themselves. But the true theory is that humans are innately moral, and we're moral because we evolved that way through what's called gene-culture coevolution. Really immoral people in a culture that values morality don't have as many children, and they're often killed or exiled. So humans are innately moral. So you shouldn't teach a wrong theory. But also, I argue that there's a real problem with successful business people. They get to the point where they're really successful, but then they have a lot of money, but they don't have a life. What do you do with your life now? You spent all your life earning money. Now you can't do anything. You're at the end of the line. So that's a bad way to live. So you see these people, what do? They have $10 million birthday parties, and they find really stupid ways of just trying to pretend that they have a real life, but they don't. Business schools should teach people to have a rounded life, which includes their material, their moral, and their social obligations to others. And if you do that, you'll have a good life, and you'll help society at the same time. And if you're hiring people, hire people that believe that too. Have organizations where people are basically committed to integrity and honesty. Now, I'm not sure that will work because that's not my business, and nobody really knows. But it does work in other fields. It does work in science. There are some cheats, but mostly scientists do the right thing, and they tell the truth, and they communicate with each other because they have a certain moral sense of what the right thing to do is if you're a scientist. Similarly for a doctor, there are plenty of cheats. We read about them all the time, ripping off Medicare and stuff like that. But mostly that's not what they do, and probably you don't think your doctors do that. You don't think your doctor's trying to rip you off. You think he's trying to help you, he or she.